Okay, ready, start panel 3. And we'll begin with structured stability spending in late modern empires, Japan, Germany, Ottoman Turkey, and Brazil. And the paper's author is Austin Mitchell from Tohoku University.
Hello, I am at Tohoku University in Sendai, Japan. I'm on a JSPS postdoctoral fellowship. The JSPS is similar to the NSF in the US. They provide really good 2-year postdocs with research grants. If anyone is interested in it, or if anyone has students who you think might be interested in it, please get in contact with me. I'm going to be talking about budgets in the late modern period, specifically for 4 empires. So my research question is, how did late modern empires determine the allocation of their budgets, given that they have many competing priorities? These priorities included both domestic and international security, international competition, developing governmental institutions, but also developing their economies, new technologies, developing new industries, and new social programs. The late modern period is especially important to understanding budgets or to studying budgets because there's lots of new opportunities, unlike the early modern period. There's new technologies, new ways of growth. So these make for new choices that these governments have to decide on. But these regimes are also different than their contemporary counterparts because these were new choices. They didn't have the advantage of learning from their own history or learning from their neighbors. So they were making decisions and learning what decisions were best on the fly. Excuse me. And it is 5 o'clock here in the morning in Japan. So I hope my voice doesn't go out here, but I don't have much practice on this time of night trying to give a presentation. I hope it'll hold up. So in this talk, I'll be talking about the argument, but I won't get into the formal model. There's a model in the paper. If anybody's interested, please go see that. I'll talk about the case selection. I do some qualitative review or analysis, but I've put it into an appendix because there's just too much for a single paper. I'll discuss the research design and the results with an eye to discussing the differences in the results across regimes. So I will be talking about 2 different types of policies. And specifically, so I mentioned there's lots of different priorities that regimes could be having, but the argument that I'm going to be making is specific to domestic security. So there's 2 different types of general policies that governments can engage in to maintain domestic security. One is repression and the other is appeasement. There's a recent annual review piece on the logic of political control, which I think it's smart about how it's categorizing these 2 different types of policies. So when we say, I'm specifically going to talk about spending policy because I'm interested in how governments allocate their budgets. So I'll talk about the spending on repressive capacity, which is investments in the threat of repression, not necessarily the use of repression. I'll also talk about public spending, which can be for economic growth and social welfare. And I'm treating public spending very generally, anything that benefits the opposition and public. We could also conceive of public spending as being more clientelistic or select incentives for individual members of the opposition. But in this project, I'm not getting into those specific types of arguments. So consistent with what theorists have been saying for decades, the first priority of a regime is to obtain a monopoly on violence. That translates into spending on repressive capacity. That's going to be the first most important priority. But as investments are made in repressive capacity, regimes will face decreasing marginal returns of these investments. So if there's already 100,000 cops on the street, adding 1 more cop doesn't give you the same marginal benefit to security as if you only had 1,000 cops on the street. So then this means, given that you have alternative policies you can use, eventually the marginal benefit of an appeasement type policy like public spending is going to outweigh the marginal benefit of another unit spent on repression. Additionally, some types of public spending reduce the effectiveness of repression spending. So think of communication technology, transportation infrastructure, and education. These types of spending, while they improve the opposition's valuation of the regime, if the opposition decides to rebel, they can aid the opposition in the rebellion. So in the revolutions of 1848, they spread in part because the telegraph spread news of them. And the protesters that were protesting used trains to get to protest sites. Trains were also important in the Russian Revolution. And in the French Revolution, areas of higher education were associated with targeting the central regime as opposed to areas of lower education. The argument is going to predict patterns of spending. And when I say patterns, I mean the shares of spending going to each of these categories. When revenue is low, a regime prioritizes spending on repressive capacity. But as it increases, as revenue increases, the regime will shift its priority away from repression spending and towards public spending. Now, this isn't to say that there's some level or threshold by which a regime fulfills its repressive capacity and then stops and then switches to public spending. That's not the argument. The argument is that the regimes are always spending on both types of policies. Both types of policies are always increasing their total spending, but the shares of spending or the relative priorities of each of these shift over time incrementally as revenue increases. So the main hypothesis is, as revenue increases, the share of spending on repressive capacity decreases, and the share of spending on the public increases. So to test this, I collect data on 4 empires of the late modern period, and I select empires that are going to provide a good contrast, but also that have some similarities between them. So I've selected empires that are on different continents. They have very different political histories, but some of them are newer, and some of them have stronger political institutions than others. In addition, I delineate individual regimes within each empire so that I can compare and contrast within the results, where the hypothesis works and where it doesn't. So I can test the hypothesis within individual regimes and then try to understand, based on the characteristics of the regimes, why the hypothesis may or may not be working or consistent with the data. So as just a precursor to the quantitative analysis, this is the data that I've collected for each of the regimes. You can see that there is log of revenue, the share of repression spending, and the share of public spending. And I'll talk about the sources here in a second. But one thing you can generally see, especially for, say, Japan and Germany, is that over time, revenue is increasing. Also over time, in general, repression as a share of total expenses is decreasing, and the share of public spending is increasing. So you can see that with the solid line for repression and the dashed line for public spending. For Ottoman Turkey, the series is fairly stable for both types of spending. Now, note that while revenue looks like it's increasing, note the scale is quite small. So this is substantively not much of a change here for Turkey. So things in Turkey seem to be quite stable over the shorter series. Brazil is a hot mess. Brazil, so this first period up until the late 1880s is the Brazilian Empire. And then a coup happens. And the coup happens because the army doesn't think they have enough funding. So they're mad and they overthrow the regime and they install a military dictatorship. So you can see that in the data that they have a much lower proportion of funding, especially if you compare it to other regimes. And then finances go sideways and wacky things start happening. So it looks like some of the data are going to be consistent with the hypothesis, but to more systematically test it, I will estimate first difference models with regime dummy interactions. So I'm going to test the difference in revenue and how it impacts the difference in shares of spending. And we're going to do that for individual regimes. So I'll be testing the marginal effect of revenue on spending share per regime. And when I estimate the model, I'll estimate it using seemingly unrelated regression because I have two different dependent variables, which is good for efficiency because it's a fairly small sample. For the data, the sample period is the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm using primary source budgets for Japan, Germany, and Brazil. I began this project back when we were still in lockdown before we had vaccines. So I was sitting in my home office in Central Texas studying budgets in foreign languages. So I had to study some kanji for the Japanese budget. And this was just before I found out that I got the postdoc. So it was a fun project to work on. I've really enjoyed this project. But for Ottoman Turkey, I haven't been able to get into their digital archives because it requires citizenship and you have to use your government ID, which I don't have because I'm not a Turkish citizen. So I'm using secondhand data for Ottoman Turkey. I prioritize ordinary expenditures because those are the regular, routine, and planned expenditures. They're also typically the predominant portion of a budget. Extraordinary expenditures are often shocks or due to shocks. So if a country is attacked or if there's a war, then they might increase their military spending. So I have total expenditures for Ottoman Turkey and for Brazil. For the dependent variables, they are in terms of shares of total expenditures. For repression spending, I'm using army expenditures, which are that excludes the Navy. And the Army is appropriate because that's the force that will be used to quell a rebellion if a rebellion happens. So that's your repression force. Additionally, policing units in many of the empires at this time period were within armies. For public expenditures, there are lots of different types of programs that could be involved for public expenditures, and they can be different across countries. So this is a kind of a long list of the different programs, which if a country engages in any of them, if they're spending on any of these things, I've included it as public expenditures. For the independent variable, I'm logging total revenue, and that is going to allow for a percentage change interpretation of the independent variable, which is beneficial because then I can utilize the domestic currency, real 1900 domestic currency, but I don't have to resort to a third-party currency like UK pounds, because that would require an exchange rate, which is introducing another variable, which could create bias, especially going back 150 years. So logging is going to be beneficial here. And then for controls, I have some time period controls, conflict, default, and a linear time variable. So this is the table of the marginal effects tests. This isn't the coefficients directly out of the estimation. This is the computed marginal effects for each individual regime. You can see that I've grayed out the cells in which the hypothesis is rejected for individual regimes and individual spending categories. So it's rejected even if it's in the right direction, but it's not statistically significant, or if it's in the wrong direction. Now, you can also see that for most of the regimes, for 5 of the 8, the spending is consistent with the hypothesis. Now, note the Taisho regime of the Empire of Japan, this coefficient for repression spending. I'm going to interpret this one specifically. It is fairly large compared to most of the coefficients, but it's not the largest. An annual change in revenue is about an average 3%, and the 75th percentile is about 10%. The 25th percentile is actually negative growth. A 10% increase in revenue predicts a 2 percentage point decrease in the share of repression spending, specifically for Taisho Japan. So in substantive context, a 2 percentage point decrease in funding would be a loss of about $20.5 million translated into 2021 US dollars. So this is specifically for the Japanese army in 1913, given the size of their budget. So the way to interpret this is when the regime's total budget increases by 10%, the loss in the growth of funding is $20.5 million, translated into dollars. So that's not to say that the total amount of the Army's funding is decreasing. It's the share of the pie that they're losing it's associated with just the total budget increasing. And like I said, most of the results are consistent across most of the regimes, except for 3 regimes that are within Japan and Brazil. So I try to think about what's going on in these cases in which the hypothesis is not consistent with the data. And I bring up a few questions, a couple questions that are not explanations at any means. I'm not going to try to explain here, but they are potential avenues, I think, for future research that could be investigated in the future. So, do political institutions matter? Germany, which I believe had the strongest political institutions of all these regimes, their spending is consistent with the hypothesis. Additionally, in both Japan and Brazil, the later regimes that have stronger political institutions, the spending appears to be consistent with the hypothesis. So that suggests that maybe political institutions are moderating budgetary politics in some way. But the spending is also consistent in Turkey, and Turkey has the weakest political institutions at the central level of all these regimes, but they're also centuries old. So perhaps it's the case that institutional history can also have a moderating effect through repeated budgets or repeated processes of deciding how to make your budgets. So these are questions that I'm going to work on going forward. The sample can be expanded for further testing. In fact, that's what we're doing here at Tohoku University in my lab. We've hired about 4 or 5 RAs, and we are expanding the sample to a couple dozen regimes. We think that this should generalize across major and minor powers of the time, but it would also be interesting to look into further scope conditions, say if pre-industrial regimes have different outcomes. Also, the argument is pretty simple. So it could generalize to contemporary dictatorships and democracies, because both of these types of governments need to maintain stability. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your feedback.
Thanks, Austin, especially for 5 a.m. The second paper, let me find it here. Yeah. Predatory Rules, Credible Commitment, and Tax Compliance in the Ottoman Balkans by Yusuf Magiya from Columbia University.
Thank you very much for having me here and being here. So I will talk about a project that examines how the rule of law affects the wealthy's wealth sheltering behavior and how it, in the end, shapes patterns of fiscal capacity building. And one recurring theme in the literature on the politics of taxation is that it is very difficult to tax the wealthy. So they can always find means to avoid taxation. And in this paper, one question that I start with is, how do the degree of rule of law in a country and as a related phenomenon, the security of private property affect the tax compliance behavior of the wealthy? And again, building on that, I ask how the ruler adopting constraints, or in other words, tying his own hands, affect his capacity to raise taxes. So I answer these questions in this paper by using the Waqf institution, which is a unique institution in Islamic law, and I will talk about it in more detail. And I also leverage a key turning point in the Ottoman Empire. And this is 1839, when the Sultan abrogated his right to confiscate people's property at will, to show that wealthy's wealth sheltering occurs more often when there is weaker rule of law, which should be pretty straightforward. But also I show that during wartime, when wealthy's predatory actions might be more common, people's wealth sheltering increase only under weaker rule of law because the ruler is not constrained. But this relationship disappears once there's a switch to strong rule of law, when there is constraints on the ruler, because people are not afraid they will be confiscated or arbitrarily taxed anymore. And as a result of this, I also show that wars increase the state's fiscal capacity under strong rule of law, but it cannot under weak rule of law because people engage in wealth sheltering when there is weak rule of law and rulers can confiscate. So to delve deeper into the theory, one point where we can start is this famous observation by Olson that autocrats often have shorter time horizons, and they can always prefer confiscating and increase their revenues in the short run to let an economy develop and enjoy economic growth and then more revenues in the long run. So we also know from a myriad of literature, most famously Norton Wengast, that if rulers can manage to tie their own hands and cannot engage in predatory actions, it is good for economic growth overall. So now war comes into the picture. Whenever war happens, rulers are in urgent need of revenues. So, especially under weaker rule of law, this creates more incentives for the rulers to confiscate people's properties. And this creates huge uncertainties for the wealthy. And because they are unconstrained, they can do whatever they want. People will engage in wealth sheltering, and the rulers cannot raise revenues even if they do not have any intention of predatory action, even if they just want to tax regular amounts. People cannot be sure that is going to happen, so they just hide their wealth. And we know that wars often make states during wartime when rulers can increase the state's fiscal capacity. But if under weak rule of law, the wealthy hide their properties, it may not be optimal for the rulers in fiscal capacity because there won't be that much assets out there which will make investment in fiscal capacity optimal. On the other hand, if rulers can commit to tying their own hands and the amount of taxation will be predictable, this can decrease wealth sheltering behavior by the wealthy, or in other words, increase their tax compliance. So there will be more assets during wartime, which will make investment in fiscal capacity more profitable, and it can make it optimal so that the rulers can invest in fiscal capacity, which means that the war makes state relationship, as famously coined by Tilly, can work under strong rule of law. And as I have argued before, it probably does not work under weaker rule of law. So the context I will be talking about, I will be evaluating this theory, is the Ottoman Empire from the 17th century until its end during World War I. So this was a context where the Sultan could confiscate any subject's property just whenever he wanted, until 1839. And again, this brought huge uncertainties for the wealth owners, especially when sultans needed more revenues during wartime. But in 1839, the Sultan issued the Gülhan Edict, where he abrogated his right to confiscate property. So we have the institution of Waqf in this context, which is often used as a wealth sheltering tool by the elite. They can divert their assets here, and it will be relatively well protected against the ruler's predation because it is seen as sacred. And you can ask, what is the downside of doing this? Why do not people always invest in Waqfs? Because once a capital is tied here, it will be immobile and it will be less lucrative compared to having a mobile capital. So each of the established Waqfs has a deed which strictly stipulates what income source is donated to the Waqf and where the income that is generated from this source can be used, or to what purpose can it be used for. And this is often unalterably fixed. Neither the founder nor the trustee can change this. And so important for our purposes, some of these waqfs benefit the founder or the founder's family, which I call family waqf, following the literature, especially Timur Kuran's definition. Or some of the waqfs provide public goods in general for at the neighborhood level or for a general community, and I call this charitable waqf. In practice, often we have waqfs that are a mix of the two. So each waqf deed has information about who is donated the money to this waqf and when it was donated, which will be very useful for our analysis. So one example that I'm going to show you so that we can understand what family waqf looks like is from 1731. This is a time when the Ottomans were at war with Iran. And this high-ranking military official, Haseki Mustafa in Crete, an island that belongs to Greece now in Mediterranean, donates huge chunk of lands and property to a waqf. And he says that 10 akçes that from the income generated from this source will be given to a preacher daily and the trustee of the endowment, but the remaining will belong to him until he dies. And after he dies, it will be divided among his children. So this is a very typical example of a self-benefiting waqf, a family waqf, because like this 10 akçes that is devoted to public goods or religious goods is amounting to only $1.8 per day in 1998 US dollars, according to my calculations. So it is almost nothing compared to the rest of the income this property can generate. And these people will enjoy it and enjoy this benefit from for generations, and this property will be protected from the Sultan's reach. So this brings me to my hypothesis. So the first hypothesis will be straightforward, and it expects waqfs that are family waqfs to be more common compared to charitable waqfs before there is a transition to strong rule of law, because people will be engaging in more wealth sheltering them. And the second set of hypotheses are about the relationship between war and the type of waqfs. So before strong rule of law is instituted under weak rule of law, I expect wars to increase the waqfs that are family waqfs compared to charitable waqfs, because people will be afraid that they will be confiscated and they will engage in wealth sheltering. However, I do not expect this relationship after there's a transition to strong rule of law in 1839. People won't be afraid anymore, so they won't be more likely to wealth shelter during wartime. And hypothesis 2.3 just expects an interaction between the rule of law and war. And next, I jump to the fourth set of hypotheses. I will come back to the third set of hypotheses later after I present the main results. So here, I am looking at the relationship between war and increases in fiscal revenues. So first, I expect that before the transition to rule of law, when there is risk of confiscation, I do not expect fiscal revenues to be higher whenever war happens. And this is because there won't be any assets to be taxed, so that the rulers will not invest in fiscal capacity. However, again, after the transition to strong rule of law, there will be assets that can be taxed because people are not afraid of confiscation, and rulers can invest in fiscal capacity building so that wars can lead to higher fiscal revenues. And hypothesis 4.3 just again expects an interaction between war and the degree of rule of law. So I am using a data set of waqfs that I collected from a published volume that provides transliterated deeds of waqfs in what is today Greece and Bulgaria. So I coded whether each waqf was a family waqf or a charitable waqf. And I also coded whether the source of income that was donated was cash and whether it corresponded to an ongoing war. I set the start date to 1600 because this is when military revolution kind of happened. And before that, wars were less costly, so they are less relevant for my purposes. And for annual fiscal revenues, I collected total annual revenues of the central treasury from secondary sources. And for wars, I'm using correlatives of war data and Claude filter. So one thing that I need to emphasize is that what the sample I have here is not a representative sample. They probably found and read whatever documents survived. And this is why I cannot do kind of a panel data analysis, or I cannot look at the sheer number of waqfs that were established in a given year, because the number of waqfs may not be independent of time. So what I do here instead is that I estimate the likelihood that an already established waqf is a family waqf rather than a charitable waqf. So I expect the waqf type to be independent of time or the probability of survival. And this way I can treat the establishment of charitable waqfs as the baseline condition and estimate how likely that someone establishes a family waqf compared to this charitable waqf. And again, this should be fine as long as the probability of establishing charitable waqfs are not affected by wars or the rule of law. And according to the literature, they should not be affected by these factors. So I estimate logistic regressions. Again, the dependent variable is whether an established waqf was a family waqf as opposed to a charitable waqf. And I have the following covariates. I have a dummy that indicates whether this is after 1839 or before 1839, indicating the degree of rule of law. I have a dummy that indicates whether this waqf is established during wartime. Another one that indicates the donor sex. Another one indicating whether the donor is state affiliated. And finally, the distance from Istanbul, the capital of the Ottoman Empire. So the first set of results confirm hypothesis one, and the second set of hypotheses. So here I am providing predicted probabilities that I estimated with logistic regressions. And y-axis shows the predicted probability that an established waqf is a family waqf as opposed to a charitable waqf. And here on the left-hand side, we have the observations that were established before 1839 under weak rule of law. And on the right-hand side, we have those under strong rule of law. So the first thing to notice is that once strong rule of law is established, the probability of family waqfs declines steeply. So the second thing to notice is that, so the red estimates here show the observations that were established during peacetime, and the blue ones show the observations that were established during wartime. Before the establishment of strong rule of law, wars increase the probability that a waqf is a family waqf. Well, we do not see this after strong rule of law is established. And again, the interaction effect between the degree of rule of law and occurrence of war is significant here. So the second set of results about wartime changes in fiscal capacity also confirm my expectations. And here I am showing the estimated change, percentage point change in fiscal revenues on an annual basis. So here we have the estimate for the years before strong rule of law is established, before 1839. And here on the right-hand side, we have the observations under stronger rule of law. So under weak rule of law, on average, wars do not lead to higher fiscal revenues. If anything, they lead to lower fiscal revenues. While when there's strong rule of law, wars seem to have a positive effect on fiscal revenues. This is not estimated to be statistically distinguishable at the 5% level, but only at the 10% level. And again, the interaction effect between the occurrence of war and the degree of rule of law is significant here. So the fourth set of hypotheses are confirmed. And a question that might come up from my discussion so far is that, okay, the ruler can promise that they will respect property rights, but why trust them? And again, Cansunar and Kur'an mentioned that a lot of Ottoman rulers had promised this before, and they just reneged on their promises. So in this specific context, we have several reasons to expect why these commitments would be more credible. So in the year 1839, the Sultan unexpectedly died, and his 16-year-old son was put on the throne, a relatively unexperienced monarch. And during the 1830s, the previous Sultan had heavily invested in a more professional bureaucracy. So suddenly, the shift of control, the control of the state apparatus shifts to the hands of the bureaucracy from the palace. And bureaucracy prefers to adopt a longer-term outlook. Being more professional, it has longer time horizons than the Sultan and autocratic ruler. And according to the literature on this period, the bureaucracy that was just developing was ideologically committed to the development of the country and modernization. So they, again, prefer developing the country in the long term rather than confiscating people's assets in the shorter term. And finally, in a more general trend, we have higher asset mobility all around the world now, but also in the Ottoman Empire. And the economy is more monetized, and the Ottoman economy is more integrated with the world economy, especially with some free trade treaties with Britain and other countries in late 1830s and early 1840s, so that people have more cash assets now, and whenever they can feel some threat, they can just hide their assets or move them abroad. So these all make the ruler's commitments more credible. I cannot test the first three points here in a systematic manner because we have n equals 1, but I can test some empirical implications of the last point here about higher asset mobility with the Waqf data that I have, and these constitute the third set of hypotheses I have. So I expect wars to decrease the likelihood that a Waqf that has been established consists of cash assets versus non-cash assets. Again, cash assets are more mobile. And in the second hypothesis, under this set of hypotheses, I expect stronger rule of law to increase the incidence of Waqfs that have cash assets. So my analysis confirmed this set of hypotheses too. So whenever war happens, it is less likely that we see cash Waqfs, but under stronger rule of law, we see a higher likelihood of cash wars being established. So I also engage in some robustness checks. I moved the start date to 1700. I exclude the territories that the Ottomans lost during this period, which actually discards around 2/3 of the observations. But the results are still robust to each of these changes. And I also use alternative fiscal revenue data of the Ottoman state, and the results are again similar. So to conclude, here, I believe these findings show that one way how states can decrease wealth sheltering of the wealthy and convince them to pay taxes might be to convince them that there are less uncertainties about the ruler's actions and make them more sure what percent of their property is going to be taxed. And here, strong rule of law and the security of people's property might be very critical for building of fiscal capacity, for the capacity of the states to tax the populations. And again, going back to Tilley's term, war-make states, it might be necessary for the war-make state relationship to work. And it might also be one reason why we have seen a lot of works that find this war-make state relationship to be not applicable to contexts outside of Western Europe, which is the canonical, which are the canonical cases which are studied by students of fiscal capacity building, including Tilley. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Yusuf. And then as the final discussant, we have Asli Cansunar from now the University of Washington.
Well, I just want to start with thanking the presenters and thanking Jeff for organizing this amazing conference. It has been super fun to listen to all the papers and see all the great work that you guys are doing in the political economy of empire. So a huge thank you to all of you guys who are involved in organizing this. I'm going to start with Austin's paper, and then I'll move on to Yusuf's paper. And I really liked both of the papers in this panel. And also, both of the papers just sit super well together and they have a lot of things in common. So I think it just made my job as a discussant much more easier to discuss these papers and to explain you guys what are the good things about these papers and what are the some parts of these papers that need some more improvement. So Austin, I really, really like this paper. Anyone who's doing any type of work in historical political economy would know data collection is a huge effort. And like data collection within a city, in an empire is so hard and it takes years. So I just want to start with commending you for actually collecting data from 4 different empires. I'm sure it was a lot of work. And at the end, we have this great paper showing us different things happening at the same time, but in super different places around the world. So the paper asks a really important question. It asks, how did empires determine the allocation of their budgets given the competing priorities during the late 19th century, early 20th century? So basically the latest years of 1800s and early 1900s. And here the trade-off for empires is basically investments in coercive capacity. So the investments in military or police or gendarmerie in some cases, or social spending, right? And there is a formal model in the paper. It's a really great formal model, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it on this discussion presentation. But basically, as a result of the model, that we get this super neat and easy to understand hypothesis, which is that as an empire's revenue increases, the share of the spending on repressive capacity decreases and the share of spending on public social services increases. So there's obviously decreasing returns to any type of spending, right? So as the repressive budget increases, then the public spending is going to increase. So it all depends on the aggregate amount of spending, and these coercive spending and the social spending are going to have different percentages depending on the aggregate amount of spending. And the paper then goes on to testing this argument using data from the empires of Japan, Germany, Ottoman, Turkey, and Brazil, again, in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And basically the paper and the author finds in most cases, the author finds evidence for the main hypothesis. The main hypothesis does not hold for a minority of cases, but then the paper goes on to explaining what would be the reasons that creates this mismatch between the empirical result and the theory. Now, I really enjoyed reading this paper, and I myself I'm a scholar on welfare states. I study public services, and my area specialty is Turkey and the Ottoman Empire. So I'm first going to start talking about public services, the history of the political economy of public services in general. And then I'll just go back to the Ottoman Empire, focus in on Ottoman Empire, and just try to help you with some of the things that might be explaining some of the results that you're finding in this paper, because I think that's where I could be most helpful in making this paper so much better than it is right now. So the first thing about spending, social spending, and spending on social public services, I was kind of confused when I was reading your paper, okay? And the reason is just the date of the years, the years frame that you're looking in the paper, which is, the last years of 1800s and the first years of 1900s, and you're looking at social spending. And we, as the scholars of welfare spending and the emergence of welfare and social states either in Europe or other places in the world, would think that, the rise of welfare states is predominantly a post-World War II phenomenon, right? And really like the beginners of spending on social expenditures is Germany, where Bismarck's bring all these social security laws to kind of stop immigration to the United States to be able to keep the workforce in Germany. So I was a bit confused about what you were saying about the public spending in late 1800s in places like, Ottoman Empire and Japan. And I thought about this graph that I, usually use in my presentations and whatnot in teaching. And I was just, going back to this data source, I was just confused because, a lot of the places that you talk about in here, Germany, Japan, you don't have you don't have Ottoman Empire data and you don't have Brazil in here, but you can see that before 1900s for Japan and Germany, the expenditures as a, share of the GDP is almost zero. So I was kind of confused about the mismatch between your data and this data. Then I realized, the data is not the same thing, because here, for example, you're looking at the percentage of expenses. On the other hand, this our world in data sets look at the social spending as a share of the GDP. So I recognize that these are not the same data. However, what's interesting is here the spending is almost zero. Okay, so it's not that the percentages are different. It's just that on one data set, the services, like the spending amount that you say is, a substantial amount in some cases, looks like it's zero. Now, this is the difference between Japan and the other data. This is the difference between Germany and the other data, and public expenditures can be seen in blue in here, okay? And so I think this mismatch between two sets of the data comes from the things that you think or that you count or identify as public spending in your paper, which might not be necessarily public spending to make opposition happy, okay? So for example, here we see social spending includes, among others, health, old age, incapacity, family, active labor, market programs, unemployment, and housing, basically some poor relief, and then some, social security, such as unemployment, sick pay, and whatnot. And let me just focus on your data. So in the data, you have like a small section in your paper, you have a small section where you talk about the data sources. And basically for Japan, for example, you have the sum of spending on the ministries of agriculture and commerce, communication and education, okay? For Germany, you still have agriculture. For Ottoman Turkey, you have agriculture. You have the post office. I'll talk about the post office later. For Brazil, you still have the Ministry of Agriculture. Now, one concern with this is that I'm not sure to which extent spending on the Ministry of Agriculture or spending by the Ministry of Agriculture can be identified as social spending, okay? And I think because you have all these spending on agriculture, or you have spending on, infrastructure that's not necessarily social redistribution, you're finding a lot more social spending in your data sets compared to some other data sets that are out there, okay? So what would be a solution? I recognize it's super early in the morning and you've spent a lot of time on these data sets. But one solution and one thing that I would really like to read either in the appendix or the main text of the paper is for you to be super clear about what these public expense data refers to, okay? And maybe the best way to do this is to do this in the appendix, just to give us examples about the type of expenses that these, aggregate measures contain from different places, okay? So I think at a minimum, you have to be super clear about these things for us to understand what public spending is in these contexts, given the information that we all have that, public spending is not a thing before Germany does it for the first time, okay? And then the second problem, I think, is that the data is not comparable given the nature of, given that you're looking at different data sources, and it's really hard to compare a data set that has agriculture spending on one hand and has something else on the other hand, okay? So another solution would be maybe a major revision, but you could also use the existing data sets by Ansel and Lidwall and Lindart, and I'll talk about these sources in a second. And now I'm just gonna touch upon a book by Ben Ansel and Johannes Lindwall. Is a fairly new book. I think it came out last year. And this book and the next book that I'm going to talk about is both important for data considerations, but it's also important for the theory, okay? Because we think that welfare states, as we know today, the welfare state, the welfare spending that makes the poor or the middle classes happy is a post-World War II phenomenon. Most of the political science work on the history of public goods or public spending looks at these maybe early modern types of public spending as a form of social control rather than policies that are enacted to make poorer or middle classes happy, okay? This is a direct quote from Ben's book, and they say when public authorities began to promote order, knowledge, and public health, they started to engage in more systematic and more insidious forms of social control. And the new machinery of public order reduced crime and violence, but also permitted the state to define social deviance and defeat challenges to its authority. And I think the name of the book is really telling. It is Inward Conquest, right? So they argue these early modern periods of social service provision is actually not a policy to make middle classes happy. It's another way of the extended coercive capacity of the state, okay? Again, Growing Public, a great book by Peter Lindart that looks at different public spending, the start of public spending in Europe says, for example, in England, I know England is not in your data set, but again, just to make my point more clear, for example, poor relief, we would think about poor relief as a policy to make the poor happy or better off, right? But for example, in England, Lindart says that the focus of poor relief was to make sure that the large landowners would have workers to work for them in long winters. So you're not helping the poor for the sake of helping the poor. You're helping the poor for them to survive so that they can come and work on your large land holdings, okay? So again, these early forms of public expenditure is a way of state's control. The last thing that I'll talk about before moving on to the Ottoman case is the great works by Agustina Paglayan, who's working on the education, the political economy of education in early modern periods, like this kind of the same time periods that you're looking at. And she would say, for example, social spending on education is not to make sure that the poor or the middle classes have the opportunities for social mobility, but rather the main goal of the governments is to promote social order and political stability. And like you can think about this turning French peasants into Frenchmen, for example. You want to make sure that you exert either assimilation or some sort of social control on people through education, and you don't care whether they become doctors or engineers. Okay, so I think all these works should be cited in your paper, and I think there should be like a section on the political economy and the political history of service provision in empires around the world. Also, one last thing, in these times, especially in the Ottoman Empire, because that's the case that I know the best, a lot of spending on education is actually on military education. Okay, so it's like military high schools, military lycées in Ottoman Empire. So again, it's kind of hard to disentangle whether these investments are done for social order, in other words, coerciveness of the state, or to keep the opposition or the masses happy, okay? So after this general overview of the political services framework, I'll just zoom into the Ottoman Empire. And this is where Yusuf's paper and Yusuf's discussion and Yusuf's presentation was so helpful. Before going into the discussion of the Ottoman Empire, I just want to maybe make you happy by saying that even if you had access to the Ottoman archives, if you didn't have at least 2 years of Ottoman instruction, it would have been impossible for you to read those documents. So you don't be sad because you didn't have access because you're not a citizen. It's impossible for native Turkish speakers to understand these types of documents. You need at least 2 years of, really serious education. That's what actually Yusuf does in his dissertation. And that's why his dissertation work is so amazing. He actually read all these documents over the last couple of years. So anyways, going back to the Ottoman Empire and welfare spending of the Ottoman Empire, now that we've listened to Yusuf's amazing presentation, we kind of know that the social services in the Ottoman Empire are done through the Vakf system, okay? And this is true until some public services start by the government in the last few decades of the empire, but actually this system kind of continues until the end of the empire, okay? So this only changes in the early years of the Republic. Why is this important? Because if you only look at the public service expenditure in the context of the Ottoman Empire, you're going to miss a lot of public service expenditure, because the tradition in Ottoman Empire is not that the state does this by redistributing tax revenue. It's actually people like elites, sultans spend on these social causes from their personal pockets, okay? And actually, there's a huge literature on Abdülhamid II and how he tried to create a legitimacy around his rule through public spending, but it's not public spending, it's Vakf endowments, okay? It's his own money philanthropically endowed for these public services. For example, I'm just going to give you one example, but there are many examples about this. There is this first poorhouse of the empire funded by Abdülhamid and some public fundraising. But actually, Abdülhamid starts selling his personal art collection and endows that money back into this poorhouse, and this becomes like a public sensation, okay? So people love this, and everyone knows that it's Abdülhamid, his personal pocket, that does this, not the state, okay? And actually, the funny thing is the opposition, Young Turks at the time, was not very happy about this because they saw how Abdülhamit was gaining popularity through this philanthropic endowment. And for example, if you look at the yearbooks of Istanbul written by an ideologically Young Turk at the time, you find little information on this first poorhouse of the empire because they didn't want to advertise this, okay? So I think it would be helpful to at least have a paragraph on the public spending on Ottoman Empire. And maybe, I was thinking the model is really intuitive. So maybe you can take some of the math to the appendix and create some, room in the paper to talk about the welfare spending in these 4 places. Obviously not devote pages to it, but at least have one paragraph that would explain us the potential pitfalls with the way that you're operationalizing and measuring these things, okay? I just 2 pet peeves of mine. I think the word Ottoman Turkey is confusing because when you say Ottoman Turkey, the way I understand it is like modern Turkey, the borders of modern Turkey, but in Ottoman Empire. So I would rather see Ottoman Empire instead of Turkey or Ottoman Turkey. And then the name of the Sultan at the time, English sources say it's Hamid, but really Turkish scholars would call him Abdülhamit II. So again, another pet peeve of mine, which you might want to include in your paper. But overall, great paper. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed reading it, and I'm really looking forward to the next iterations of this paper. Let me just go back to Yusuf's paper, and I really like this paper. This is an incredible data work. This is incredibly important, not only for Middle East politics and the political economy, historical political economy of the Middle East, but I think it's also important because of all the implication it has for the property rights, the rule of law, and how actually strong rules of law impacts the government's budget in a super positive way. So Yusuf just explained to us that this paper explores how the wealthy's tax evasion behavior is shaped by the rule of law and its consequences for fiscal capacity building. And individuals are more likely to shelter wealth under weak property rights. And this becomes even more pronounced during war periods, because obviously during the war, the emperors or the sultans need more revenue, so they're more likely to expropriate or tax heavier, right? And this in turn has implications for fiscal revenues. So it's not only a behavior change, but it has institutional impact on the empires as well. And the paper uses an original data set on Ottoman WACs that covers the WACs in modern-day Greece and Bulgaria. And he also uses some annual Ottoman fiscal revenue data to look at the fiscal implications of wealth sheltering under different rule of law regimes in the Ottoman Empire. So the rest of my discussion might be boring for some of you guys in the audience. I'm really sorry about this, because this is now a conversation between 2 WACF nerds, okay? So I'm really sorry if I'm going into too much detail, but I just have so many questions about the data and I just want to know more. So the first question, and actually I think this question became more clear now that you showed the example of the WACF deed in your presentation. Did you code any information on the endowments of people? Because another theory that could be generated from your discussion in the paper is that people would be maybe more likely to endow bigger endowments in pre-1839 periods. And maybe the same way that the war has an impact on that before and after 1839, that could matter on the endowment size, right? Now, as someone who's working on the WACs, I know it's not always easy to calculate the value of these things because, someone endows a house, you don't know what's that worth, or like a couple of trees, for example, how are you going to know that? But to have like maybe a simple coding that would indicate whether land is endowed, houses are endowed, how many houses, or, sometimes people just endow a couple of books or like a gold bracelet. So maybe just a simple coding of these things might be informative. And I know that's a lot of work, but this is just the luck nerd in me trying to understand more about the data set that you have, okay? And again, if you had that type of coding, and if you did that type of coding, you could see whether the size or the type of endowments change before and after 1839, and whether, the war has any impact on this change, okay? You actually kind of talked about this in your presentation, but in the paper, it wasn't super clear. So I'm wondering about the coverage of this book that has this Waqf deeds, okay? Because the different types of selections, because of different reasons, might have different impact on your data set. As we're all working on historical political economy here, so sometimes things get, screwed up in the archives, they burn, they get water damage. So sometimes that's why you have not a full data set, but sometimes, the person who's publishing this book goes to an archive, just chooses few Waqf deeds, and that's why we have a selection. So I think if you had like a paragraph explaining the coverage and whether whether the reason that you don't have the whole universe of Waqf deeds is about the survivability of these documents in the archives, or whether it was like a personal choice by the author, and whether you have an estimate about what percentage of Waqf deeds you can undercover from this data source, I think it would be helpful and informative to really think about the selection bias issues in here. So I think it would be super helpful if you have more examples, either in the main text or in the appendix, about how you call the family Waqfs and charitable Waqfs, okay? As someone who worked with all the Waqf deeds, like thousands of them, I know this is really hard. I know it's not straightforward because, as you said, sometimes, these charitable causes just exist at the same time with these, selfish causes. But the difficulty of this makes it even more important for you to be clear in explaining how you coded these things. As I understand from your discussion and as I understand from your presentation, you use like one drop rule. So if there's something selfish, you code it as a family Waqf. But like, I would just like to see more discussion about this and maybe examples of your coding in the appendix, because I think that would make it much more clear. And also, what do you do about the caretakers? For people who are not very familiar with Waqf deeds in Ottoman Empire, sometimes the cause is charitable, but sometimes you have like a caretaker, a mutawalli of the Waqf, that gets some salary from the Waqf, and that's usually a family member. So how do you code these things in those cases, for example? I think it's important to talk about these things. Let me see if I'm running out of time. I have a minute left, so I'll be a bit quicker. Again, this is the data nerd in me talking. Do you have any non-Muslim Waqf founders in your sample? And if you do, whether that changes pre-1839 and after 1839, because we know in 1839 you get equal rights for non-Muslims in the empire, right? So I would love to see your data set and to see whether you end up having a non-Muslim Waqf founder, given this is a data set from Bulgaria and Greece, where there is a lot of the Greek population of the empire at the time, okay? One last thing about data. Do you have any data on tax rates? Do you have any data about the changing tax rates across the years that would potentially be impactful on the level of wealth sheltering in the Ottoman Empire? I think this is my last point about your paper. And this is about the woman result that you're finding, and I quote this directly from you, the female donor dummy is also worth some discussion for the post-1839 subset. While women are not likely to shelter wealth under weak rule of law, they're now more than 3.7 times more likely than men to establish a family wealth under stronger rule of law. And you say this is possibly because it's more difficult for them to establish and operate a business compared to males. This is where I would strongly disagree with you, because obviously women's rights are not perfect under Ottoman rule. They're not perfect anywhere around the world at this time. But actually, if you look at court data from Istanbul's court, you would see that women are super active in like gedik trades, other types of partnerships, other types of property transactions. So this is like not true that women sit at home and they don't interact with the economy. They do. I think here the reason would be because of Islamic inheritance rules, because under Islamic inheritance rules, men get twice as much of inheritance as women get. But again, in these times, this is important. At least women have some rights, because elsewhere in Europe at the time, there is primogeniture, okay? And we know that male relatives try to get women's rights and like women's property from that through some games and corruption, right? So I think before 1839, women of the family was seen as a wealth shelter. Maybe elites were, male elites were selling their property to their sisters or to their wives or to their daughters to make sure that they wouldn't be subject to expropriation, so they were safe. But after the rule of law, after 1839, when everyone had like this promise of rule of law, the males started to get pissed about females getting share of the property. So women, in order to protect their property from their male relatives, they started endowing funds for these family wealths so much more than they used to do pre-1839, okay? I just have one last stylistic comment. I don't want to take away too much from the discussion. Maybe you can reduce the number of hypotheses. I personally find it a bit confusing when you have like more than 4 or 5 hypotheses. And I think in this paper, you can just, aggregate them, summarize them, just make them more clear. And then I found figure 1 confusing. So I think it would be much better if you had like the good old bar graphs over like 10 years or use some sort of smoothing technique so we could understand this better. But I can send you the slides later on and we can discuss more about this. I don't want to take any more time from the discussion. Thank you so much for letting me discuss these papers. They were amazing.
Thank you, Asli. So I built in some extra time between the final panel and the book presentation, so we shouldn't worry about going overtime here. Let me give the paper givers some time to respond to anything Asli said. Austin, did you want to start?
Thank you very much for these comments. They were really terrific. You've pressed the project in ways that are going to be very beneficial. So thank you for all of them. One response question I want to ask. So you were mentioning about social spending doesn't begin till later, but in addition, lots of these types of spending aren't just to make people happy, they're for the purpose of social control. And I very much see how in the paper I talk about it as more appeasement type policies, but I am also aware that, say, education spending was to the purpose of building national identity and so on. So my question is, do you think that after having read the paper and given this your comment, could I potentially be changing the conceptual, how I'm using these types of spending? And it basically like how I talk about these types of spending. Do you think there's room for that as opposed to some sort of, basically that's my question. I don't want to talk too much because I'm a bit loopy at the moment.
You want to respond, Asli?
Yeah, I mean, if I have time, obviously, I think I really like the paper and I really think the results are there and the theory is great. So I think the paper needs just a bit of discussion about these things and maybe just to make sure that you include these things like as alternative explanations or like things that we should be mindful of as discussion in your paper. I think it will make the paper much better. So I think it just needs a bit of incorporation of these literatures and a bit of, possible ways through which maybe what you're saying is not universally true all the time. So like looking at the results, just being mindful of these issues would be great. And it would make the paper so much better. Thank you.
Thanks. And definitely points taken on the multiple literatures I missed in putting some more into the appendix. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Austin. Yusuf, did you want to respond at all?
Yeah, so I can try to briefly provide answers to each of the questions. So Austin had asked a question on the chat about debts. So I do not think debts are included in these total revenues. So I think it should be fine. And if anything, they start borrowing from the international market only in the 1850s. So if it can drive the results some way, it should drive it in the opposite way. To that what I'm expecting. So I guess I am fine in that regards. So Jeff, I think Asli partly answered your question. But yeah, like it is often, as Asli described, very difficult to classify as one or the other. But in choosing how to code this, I relied on Timur Kuran, where he says that when these people were establishing family waqfs, in order to, I think, avoid social sanctioning, they had to, or they often preferred to include a little bit of public goods in there, like the example that I showed in the presentation. So that's why whenever there is any self-benefiting item in there, I code it as family waqf. And yeah, there could be more fine-grained measures, I guess, but what I'm afraid there is that it is doable, but it is going to be much more difficult to justify why I code certain things as they are, while it is much more tractable in this way. Yeah, and about Asli's points, so regarding coverage, unfortunately, the authors do not provide any information about it, so I do not talk about it. And no, there are no non-Muslim waqfs, unfortunately. It could be interesting to have some variation in that, yeah. And the distance to vilayet centers, it's definitely doable, and I'm gonna try to see if that changes anything. And there is no systematic data on tax rates, unfortunately. But thank you for the comments. They are going to be really useful.
Okay. Jan, did you have a question? Okay, there you are. Okay.
Yes, I didn't want to interrupt the replies though. So I just wanted to build up on Asli's great comments for Austin. And Asli already, spoke about a lot of the issues that also came to my mind when I heard about your theory and the way you think about spending. And it seems to me your emphasis is fully on the repressive capacity. And it's not so much on what determines the increase in social spending, right? I mean, you basically just say there are higher returns than to social spending, and that's why we see less investment in repressive capacity. And Asli already pointed to some of the literature that I think you should include. And what I would just like to make a little bit more forcefully is this point that what happened at this time to some of the societies that you consider is that there was a really massive transformation of the way they were structured from a socioeconomic perspective. I actually make this point in a recent paper that I'm happy to send to you. It is industrialization is associated with the intensification, amplification, and also spatial concentration of social exchange and economic exchange. And what that leads to is a rise in externalities that requires more public and social spending, and also then the rise of the bureaucratic state. So that's the main point I make in this paper. But I really think industrialization and all these social transformative processes, I think you should acknowledge them a little bit more as a possible co-determinant of these spending dynamics. And so I don't want to suggest, I think similar to what Asli said, that you should fundamentally change the framing of the paper, but I would like to see maybe at least a quick section on how that could influence what you're observing and how it could shape the trends that you are identifying. And other than that, I think it's a great paper and you're on a really great path, but I do think Asli made some very important comments there.
Thanks. That's a really good point that there, if I could summarize what I heard, there's a drive for various types of spending that are either demanded or necessary because of changing conditions. And that's something I do not consider or talk about at all. So that's the point well taken. Thank you very much for that.
Okay, great third panel. Thanks to the two paper givers and the discussant for an excellent panel. So we'll reconvene at 1:45 my time, so 23 minutes from now, for the book manuscript presentation by Sean Gailmard. Dan Carpenter and Emily Sellers will be the discussants.